Why narrowband networks hold promise for IoT. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Evan Cummack, head of IoT for Twilio Incorporated. Welcome, Evan.
Hey.
So what does Twilio do, and what role does IoT play for the company?
Yeah, so Twilio is a company that's fairly well known in the developer community for providing communications, what we call a communications platform as a service. We've been providing APIs to developers for multi-channel communications, things like SMS, things like voice. For a number of years, we have other products in the customer engagement space as well. And a few years ago, we got started in IoT. And in particular, when we talk about IoT, we're thinking about what you might call wide area IoT, things that are connected to the world's wide public networks, in particular cellular networks, devices that can exist outside of the home, in industrial settings, commercial settings, municipal settings, transportation, things like this all over the world.
Analysts are predicting billions of connected devices in the next few years. As you see the market, how are those predictions actually holding up?
So it depends who you talk to, I think, but I don't know that it's really useful to dwell maybe on some of these predictions, because they predict a notion of a connected device, but the notion of a connected device is hugely varied. You have obviously tons and tons of devices connected to private networks like Wi-Fi networks inside the home. And it's a really radically different use case to say something that you would see in transportation, or something that you would see in a smart city setting. So I think there's this sentiment all of a sudden that maybe we're not living up to the hype as an industry, and that the device count is not somehow living up to this magical number that someone made up some number of years ago anyway. And I think to counter that, actually what we are seeing now is in our particular space. So let's talk about cellular IoT for a while. Historically, devices that you wanted to connect to the internet or to a network outside of the home, you would connect to a 2G or a 3G network or an LTE network, basically networks that were designed for something else. So the performance characteristics of those networks were designed to support essentially human communication devices. And it's only really in the last year or two that you start to see deployment and adoption of technologies like narrowband IoT that are actually really specifically designed and deployed from the ground up to support IoT devices. And we already see quite a significant amount of innovation, business model innovation, and also just technical innovation as developers start to leverage those technologies to build a next generation of use cases that either wasn't possible before with the previous technologies, or more likely was not a positive return on investment before, because the technologies they were using weren't designed for what they were doing, and so the costs were too high, or the performance characteristics weren't there for what they needed. So I think we have a very, very positive outlook on the number of devices that are shipping today, the number of devices that will ship this year, and also the number of new companies that are entering the space and starting to build new products.
What exactly is a narrowband network, and why does it hold so much promise for IoT?
So narrowband is, it's actually right there in the name in a weird way. So you probably heard the term broadband before without ever really thinking about what it meant. And narrowband is sort of the literal opposite, if you will. Basically networks that are focused on low throughput, not necessarily low latency, so potentially high latency, but very focused on huge numbers of devices that use very little spectrum, which reduces cost, very basic hardware requirements, which reduces the bill of materials for building a device. And basically the goal is, instead of just chasing higher performance and higher throughput, let's see how we can get the total cost of building and shipping a device down to just a few dollars, because we think that's where we start to justify a whole slew of IoT use cases that couldn't have been justified on a high bandwidth, high cost connection.
What are some of the new use cases that we might actually see with narrowband?
So there's a few things that we see starting to happen already, and I think this notion of return on investment is really important. So you need to either be able to justify a use case in terms of it's going to make me some amount of revenue, or it's going to save me some amount of money for the most part, as a product creator. And so we see some really interesting use cases. In one of my favorites, which is kind of trivial, is in waste management, where instead of saying, okay, we're going to have garbage trucks that just drive around and go to the same dumpsters every single day or once a week and empty them no matter how empty or full they are, instead, because now we can connect these devices for just a few dollars a year, we can actually know at any given time exactly how full each of these dumpsters are. We can either plan an intelligent route so that we spend the least amount of time out in a truck driving around aimlessly, or we can do things like apply machine learning and make sure that our route is entirely dynamic all of the time and based on like the most efficient way of going and collecting waste. So it's a really simple use case. It's something we're seeing people doing, but I like it because of the kind of business model innovation and just because of the efficiency that it brings through such a simple notion. But there's still a fairly high value in terms of money use case. These are pretty big devices that are performing a pretty high dollar value activity. But you can imagine that as the cost comes down lower and lower and lower, that all of a sudden you can start to do that kind of efficiency monitoring and optimization with devices and workloads that are increasingly lower dollar value, basically.
What'll happen when to privacy specifically, when billions of IoT devices are collecting ambient intelligence?
Yeah, so ambient intelligence is a pretty interesting term as well. Like one of the things that we're seeing right now, which is really cool, is you have these micromobility is the term that the industry uses, but basically these connected scooters and e-bikes and bikes that are starting to pop up in cities all around the world. And one of the cool things that these devices can do by virtue of existing and being in large numbers and being geographically distributed around urban spaces, is they can start to collect information that maybe you wouldn't think that they were collecting. So for instance, they can collect air quality information. And because they're moving around the city, you get a good picture at any given time of how air quality differs throughout the city, throughout the day, which is a pretty interesting idea based primarily on the fact that that data is not the primary use case for that device, but it does have some value to someone. Maybe that's for the city, or maybe it's for someone who's doing research for some product development. But that obviously has an impact on privacy. I think for the most part, there's a couple of things that are happening here. One is you're starting to see the market itself actually, for the first time, maybe convincingly take a stance on privacy. Even some of the large software companies coming out and taking clear stances here, which was a little bit unheard of probably even 5 years ago. And then the other thing is that you have just a very serious trend of governments around the world that are starting to introduce serious privacy laws as well. So it's a little bit, I think, speculative to talk about like which of those will be more successful. But I certainly think that most of the folks who are really seriously thinking about IoT deployment have privacy at the front of their mind.
What type of trends do you see for IoT in the coming year?
I think the biggest trend that we are really betting on is the fact, well, there's probably two. One is, I think today when we talk about IoT, we have this real tendency to jump towards in-home stuff, home automation, and very simple devices that connect to Wi-Fi networks. And there's a real race to win that market, in particular by the large software vendors, the Googles and the Apples and the Amazons and Microsofts of the world. But there's this other playing field that is, I think, significantly larger, just based on the diversity of potential use cases. And also is probably a market that is going to have to be tackled by a large group of startups, of innovators, of new companies. And that's the stuff that I was talking about earlier, the smart city and agricultural, industrial, commercial, all these types of use cases. They're so broad, there's so much room for innovation that I really think, and with these technologies like narrowband coming around, there's a real platform to go and try and exploit those opportunities. And so I think you see two things here. One is you start to see conversations about IoT start to focus more around not necessarily that home automation, voice assistant type use case inside the house, but more about the things that are outside and in our lives every day. And the other is that we will start to see, hopefully, larger numbers of smaller companies and innovators and startups starting to tackle a lot of these problems. Right now, it's extremely difficult, I think, still, and quite opaque in terms of if you are an innovator and this is your first time going out and trying to solve a combined hardware-software connectivity problem. It is still quite hard, quite opaque to know how to do that in a best practice manner. And that's one of the things that we're trying to help with here as well.
Evan Cummack, head of IoT for Twilio Incorporated. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to find out more about the future of IoT, how can they do that?
Yeah, so there's two ways. One is via Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my last name, Cummack. And the other would be via email. We love talking to customers one-on-one. My email address is just my initials, EC, Echo Charlie @twilio.com.
Sounds good. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or go to my website, tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.